Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Grounded Conversations. For those who don't know, I'm Olivia, and today I'm joined by a very special guest, Dr. Randolph Schiffer, who has had an incredibly interesting life and career, from serving as a Marine to becoming both a neurologist and psychiatrist, and later the founding director of the Cleveland Clinic Center for Brain Health. He's now an author, with his work exploring fear, courage, and the stories we carry through life. I'm really excited for this conversation because I think fear is something everybody experiences, but very few people actually understand. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Olivia.
So your book immediately stands out by the title, Bedtime Stories to Terrify Children. What reactions do people usually have to that? Because the idea of terrifying children, I can imagine, doesn't always have the best reactions. So what do you think the title reveals about the way we think about fear?
Well, the title puts some people off, I have to say. Not the children, they go for it in a second. But some of the grown-ups and parents, it puts them off. The title is a little approximate, too. Although the 8 stories in the book are scary and could be read to children or told to children as scary stories, they all have reasonable, okay denouements, and they can be read at a much different level as to emotional expression about handling the development of our responses to fear and anxiety in our life.
Yeah. What's the most common question do you think people usually ask you after hearing the title?
I think the most common question is, do you think these could harm children? To which I say, no. I developed these stories with my wife and my own 2 children when they were small, and they're not really as scary as the title implies. But it is true that the wrong kind of story or movie or video or whatever can harm children. And when I was young in medicine, I spent 3 months at the Menninger Institute in Topeka on the adolescent ward. And we had a teenager there who had been harmed by the movie The Exorcist, which someone had taken him to see at just the wrong time in his adolescence. So one does have to think about that.
Yeah. So when it comes to the stories in your book, then what do you think makes them so attractive to children who, especially because they're meant to be terrifying, what do you think draws children to them?
Well, if you look at a children's bookstore window, Olivia, and they have the books lined up there, which I do sometimes, children's books have gotten quite mushy, in my view.
Yeah.
There's a picture of a little lamb who's totally melted down emotionally because she's gotten separated from her flock. A picture of a choo-choo train who's totally sleepless and anxious about whether he can do his run the next day. All very kind of dull. Now, if you put my book with its pictures in the window, with the kind of the scary window and the scary picture of the children, here, I'll show it to you. Here's a picture of it right here.
Yes.
Well, the children would go for that in a second, but the grown-ups are not so sure. It's the grown-ups who are afraid.
No, I do get that. I mean, well, I've got a younger brother anyways, and my mum works in a nursery. And so we have all sorts of stories about kids. But I do think it's interesting how when you do go into bookstores, how all the books do seem to sort of sugarcoat everything rather than making it more interesting.
But see, children know that life is not that way. So when they hear a story that's suspenseful, that has good and evil spirits, they're quite comfortable with that.
Yeah. So what made fear such an important thing for you to explore then?
Well, these stories came from our own family life experience. These 2 boys we have, they're now 40 and 38 years old. But when the older one was 3, he was diagnosed with ALL, acute lymphocytic leukemia, a disease which at that time was 50% fatal. So my wife and I were both doctors, and I was in pediatrics a lot at that time, too.
Yeah.
I'd taken care of some of these children. Of the 50% who died at that time, I knew from working with them that it wasn't all from the biology of the cancer. A number of them died because they were unable. They didn't have the fortitude to take the treatment, or their families didn't, because the treatments were long and arduous and painful. So I didn't think about it. It just happened sort of as we got into this with our boy, that I had always told them some bedtime stories. I thought I would re-engineer the bedtime stories to aim at the development of courage for our son for what lay ahead for him.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I mean, my brother was born with heart issues, so I completely get being in an environment around that and how scary that can be. And I think because like my own dad he used to like get our teddy bears and tell stories with our teddy bears before we used to go to sleep. So how do you think it helps to bring families together in that situation when they're reading stories like yours that bring fear up?
Well, I think participation, you want the children to be in the story with you, reading it with you. Now, there are different ways to do that. I'm interested with what you said about your father and the teddy bears. The way I did it was these stories had our two boys, Randy and Brenton were their names. They were right in. They were characters in the stories.
Yeah.
So there was no question that they were participating. And children's imaginations are such that I think at times the two boys and maybe myself, it was a little hazy as to what was real and what was story.
So when we do feel fear, what actually happens in our minds and bodies, especially in kids, because I think it can be quite intimidating to feel the feeling of fear without actually knowing what's going on inside of us. I think even as an adult, people can feel like that. So could you maybe explain how that sort of occurs?
Well, we are all born with fear and anxiety, but courage, the ability to act, think, and speak in spite of fear, that has to be learned. There are plenty of anxious and fearful infants. There are no courageous infants. So that has to be learned starting at about age 3. And I think that there are a number of ways to learn it. However, we don't want to get to what we want to do is courage is not the absence of fear. Courage, as I understand it, is the ability to carry on in spite of it.
Yes, I definitely agree. Do you think the way you've viewed fear has changed from when you were a child to now?
Yes, it's the learning process about mastering or coming to understand fear and anxiety and other dysfunctional emotional states. It goes through a number of stages. I think the most important stages are probably from about age 3 to 12. Before age 3, you can tell a child a bedtime story doesn't have that much impact on her. But from 3 on, I think that storytelling, if the stories are appropriate and have galvanizing characters, heroes and villains, that's an important learning for the children. And of course, the parents' example of how the parents deal with their own fears and uncertainties. The children see that. They know who we are. So that modeling creates internal senses of who we are, starting from, I think, early on, age 3, age 4. But then the learning about this is a lifelong thing. We learn till the very end how to improve our self-understanding of our fears and improve them. And some very important therapeutic development happens later in life, such as the age you're at, in late teenage and early 20 years.
So could you expand on that a bit more about how fear does change between different ages and how that can look for the different years people are in?
All right, now, by the way, remember, in all this, fear is a good thing, and anxiety is a good thing. Without a little anxiety, we wouldn't be able to do this podcast if we weren't a little bit nervous about it, or we wouldn't prepare, and we wouldn't be effective. I'll give an example about learning about fears that can occur in early adult life. Okay. Just to talk about I was a Marine officer in the Vietnam War. The training that we had to go through over a period of several years, actually, before we went over there, were such that I and others like me were able to do things under circumstances that probably most young men and women couldn't do. But that was a learning that occurred in early adult life. And in middle and even later adult life, I think there are other learning processes which help us understand ourselves and do well.
Yeah, it's really interesting. How do you think the stories we do hear as kids affect us later in life as adults?
It's hard to know for sure, but one thing that I am pretty sure of, the characters, the mythologic quality of the heroic animals, children, grown-ups, those things stay with us, sometimes explicitly, into our adult and late adult lives. They're not always conscious, but they're there. And even our two boys who now are in their close to 40, they'll still occasionally mention some of the heroic dogs or other animals from the stories.
Could you tell us a bit more about the animals that are in your stories and just a bit more about that?
Well, there's a variety of animals. Some are good, some are bad, just like people.
Yeah.
The favorite animal, every story has the title of an animal: bear, squirrel, dog, monkey. But the stories aren't really about animals. They're about these other parenting and child development things. But The animal they mention the most, they don't talk about it a lot, our two boys, but okay, is the horrible squirrel who presided over the ragged hole in space and time that swallowed children up. They love that
Wow.
story. The hole did eat a couple of children, but in the end, the ending was satisfactory and there was a heroic figure, but they remember that squirrel.
That's so interesting. I think, especially when it's animals, it's so easy for us to remember them when we grow up because they're such an easy thing to sort of remember and carry with us. So do you think sometimes, even if we don't necessarily remember stories from our childhood, do you think we can carry the narratives from them throughout our whole life without even knowing?
Yes. How it actually works, I think we don't, it's hard to say, but I think that the story narratives, probably more powerful is the modeling of the parents. How do the parents solve their problems? How do the parents admit to uncertainties, self-doubts, fears in the way they talk or withhold things from talking with the children? The children are much more sensitive to all this than the parents know.
So you obviously
are comfortable. The parents are comfortable sharing their own self-doubts at times, their own disagreements, uncertainties. That's a powerful example for the children.
Do you think, just in general, the importance of sharing things we're fearful makes a difference?
I think definitely, yes. Again, I'm not speaking scientifically, but from a lifetime in psychiatry, doing therapy and much work with children too. See, in this stage, there's a stage of life, the first stage, this is part of it, I'll just say somewhere. I consider the years from about 0 to 30 where you still are as the first stage of life, and the task of that stage is to get an answer to the question, who am I? To get a feeling for what my interests are, my abilities, my talents, my effort. And it takes about 30 years to get an understanding like that. But it's never end. It's something that goes on forever. But I would say until about age 30, you're working on that question.
Do you think fear can sometimes hold people back from answering that question because people can feel just ashamed and scared of putting themselves forward for things?
Yes, chronic fear and anxiety is will make you miserable and it will make you ineffective. So there has to be some overcoming of it. Or, for example, a 19-year-old couldn't host a podcast like this without having managed this task.
Yeah. So do you think when we grow up and are in fearful situations, do you think even if children aren't necessarily told what the fearful thing is, that they can feel the fear of other people and just sense it?
Yes, the course definitely fear and anxiety are related. Sometimes I lump them together. Fear, there's often a specific object. Anxiety is sometimes a generalized nervousness and unease. But the psychoanalytic movement thought, and I agree with this, that to understand ourselves, including the way our own fears and anxieties are, that is the important first step in mastering them. So now in the stories book, the bedtime stories books, the stories are all suspenseful. There is fear on the part of the boys, who are also the characters in the stories, sometimes overwhelming fear, so that they can't function. So they are engaged through the stories in that developmental experience. But it turns out all right always.
Nice. Do you think there's a difference between the being in how we feel when we're in real danger and the kind of fear we create in our own minds?
I'll rephrase that question. What's the balance between fear or anxiousness that's justified by things in the world around us and that which is from inside us and is dysfunctional? Yes, I think there's a whole spectrum on that. And people who have chronic and unmanageable fearfulness, indecisiveness, timidity, anxiety, they're ineffective in life. The two major tasks, in my view, for us are to develop the ability to, through our work, contribute to our community, and through love or whatever that is, to make whatever is a family for us and to carry it through. And people who have unmanaged anxiety, especially if they're not sensitive to it, they can't do either very well.
So what would you say to somebody who might be listening to this and is feeling a bit anxious or fearful about something, what advice would you give them, or just what would you say to them?
Well, if I was a psychiatrist for 35 years, there's some things I would say to anxious people. By the way, anxiety it's a difficult psychotherapeutic task, but there are some things I would say. I'm not recommending this, but especially later in my career, I would try to reframe this first of all, self-awareness, the task of realizing that this comes from inside them and may not be justified. But then I'd kind of reframe it and say, well, it's lucky that you have these anxious fears, because those things you don't have to worry about. What you fear will never happen. And that's pretty much true. But you have to be careful with that.
Yeah, I do agree. I think sometimes it's so easy to get in our own heads and worry about things. Like, I know my grandma was telling me a while ago, because she had to do counselling for something, that her counsellor would get her to imagine a worry tree, and all of her worries would be leaves on the tree, and she had to imagine all the things she couldn't control falling off the tree. So I think a lot of the fears we do feel and anxieties are things we can't control.
Yeah, I would, and sometimes I think reframing it's hard to, the other thing I would do is sometimes to reframe it, again, you have to be careful, but sometimes, like in people who had somatic fears of their heart stopping or something like that, and there are people who are disabled by that, I would say, well, go ahead. Go see if you can stop your heart with your anxiety. Do all you can tomorrow to make that happen. And then report back to me on Friday. And they would laugh at that. They would be skeptical about it. But what I was trying to teach them in their adult life was that there is another way to look at this that's healthier.
Yeah. So how would you reframe fear to people that have... So I think people can often feel ashamed of it and try running away from it as much as they can. So how would you reframe it to sort of make it seem less scary and less of a thing to avoid, and rather help people overcome it instead?
And these are difficult things. And it's an individual thing. Another technique that I would do sometimes, if one thinks about fears, anxiety, emotional impairment from experiences earlier in their life, post-traumatic stress-like syndromes, and sometimes, especially toward the end when I was more comfortable with my work, and they would say, well, do you want to hear about this terrible thing that happened to me when I was a child? And I would say no. Teaching them to repress it and move on and not dwell on it. Because some people get stuck in their development with, for example, painful experiences earlier in their life. I'm not going to, say everyone's different about this, but at some point when you're older than maybe you are, Olivia, you got to let it go and move on. So talking about it then makes it worse.
So would you recommend just sort of trying to get over it without dwelling on it and talking about it too much then?
To a certain extent, a certain period of time. Another example is the post-traumatic stress things from the wars, of which we have a ton now. But what the Veterans Department does is they have a group that meets down here, I'm in New Mexico, the Veterans Hospital in Albuquerque has a group every Friday afternoon that tells their post-traumatic stress stories from the Vietnam War. That's 50 years ago. And they want to know if I would come. I said, absolutely not. It's harmful to keep talking about these things. You should shut that group down and don't ever do it again. Oh, well, they didn't like that, but I'm sure I'm right.
How would you recommend just letting go of things like that then? So I think people can find it hard to do that, and a lot of people feel attached to things and find it hard to let go of things like that.
Yes, well, repression, denial, but repression is an internal. It's not a forgetting of it, it's a repression of it. Everyone, you can give the person a task to do that. Why don't you try this and stop talking about it? And I would be modeling for them, because they would say, well, do you want to hear what happened to me? And I would say, no, I don't want to hear that at all. So I'm teaching them that here I'm the big psychiatrist, but I didn't want them to tell me about it. Why? Because it's harmful for them to keep talking about it. And if you stop talking about it, after a while, you don't think about it so much.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting perspective. When it comes to children, though, when they're feeling fearful, and whoever they're coming to, whether it's like parents listen to this or something, how would you recommend people helping children through their fears?
Yes, children are different. What I'm talking about are adults who are stuck on childhood fears. If we do better with the children, people won't be so stuck later. That, I think, being with them, engaging with them, whether reading together, or just being together, acknowledging from time to time our own fears as parents, just letting them talk about it, giving them some reframing in whatever way is appropriate. I think that's what does it. That's what helps. And what builds their own identity is the sharing with the children of our identities. And that's why who we are, not who we feel we are, how we act. Do we act in accordance with who we see ourselves to be? They sense all that and they learn from that, from those identifications.
Could you expand more on what you were saying about the identity bit as well, please?
Yes, the identity, our internal identities, sense of who we are, what we're doing, our talents, our abilities. We can never fully know who we are because part of who we are comes from the outside world. Some comes from healthy introspection, psychotherapeutic work. For example, if we decide, well, I'm a professional basketball player type person and I'm short, well, the world is going to tell me that I'm not a professional basketball player. So there's a continuous interaction with feedback from the outside world, and it never ends. But so what I would say about that, this is what the psychoanalyst said, and I believe this part, I liked it. Understanding and knowing oneself is a long-term, lifelong project.
Yeah. I think knowing ourselves is something we obviously spend our whole lives trying to figure out. And so what would you say to somebody who is sort of struggling with their identity and who they are?
What I call psychotherapy is for that, to help them explore themselves. Half of the therapeutic value of anything in medicine is diagnosis, the understanding of what it is, or getting a clarification. Because we fear the most what we understand the least, including inside ourselves. So the therapies themselves, if they lead to greater self-understanding, including of emotional states, that in itself is very helpful.
Really interesting. So what do you think courage actually looks like in everyday life, rather than just like being in fearful moments, but every day I think we have to take moments of courage? So what do you think that looks like?
Right. And it looks best when it's not seen. For example, coming back to our podcast here, you've developed these podcasts. You invited me. Here I am. There is performance anxiety before every one of these things. If I have learned to perform satisfactorily in spite of the performance anxieties and fears, then it won't be seen. You and whoever watches this podcast will see me and say, well, he just said what he has learned from his life in psychiatry about these things. It'll be invisible.
It's really interesting. So I have one final question for you. So what's one thing you hope people understand differently about fear after reading your book or hearing conversations like this?
I think the point of the book is substantially a children's book. The single most important lesson I'm transmitting for the grown-ups and the parents is teach the children well in accordance with some of the lessons in the book, so they will be better as to courage and identity struggles than we were.
Okay, and if people wanted to find out more about your book or you, where would you recommend they look?
They could buy it, and then I'll get some money. I have a website. The O'Mara Press is the greatest. It's a new type of publisher, and they've made a website for me. It's called randolphschiffer.com. I actually don't look at it. It's fabulous. I don't look at it too much because the guy that's there on the website and how he acts and all his accomplishments, it makes me nervous because it's like the person I always hoped to be, but I was never really sure I was. But you can order the book on the website too.
Yeah, I'll put it in the bio for anybody interested as well, so they can easily find it. So thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. I really enjoyed having you here.
All right. You're welcome. And thank you for having me, Olivia.
Yeah. And thank you everybody for listening as well.